We've got a problem. There's a big mystery at the heart of ancient Greek warfare, and what you think you know may be wrong. And not just when it comes to the usual culprits of historical movies and historical games, but from the historians themselves. This is a bold statement to make, but it comes from some rather basic facts. No one has actually seen Greek hoplites in battle. Even if they had, these hoplites evolved over the years. And when it comes to interpreting this history, schools of thought themselves have also evolved. This has all led to a troubling dilemma. We don't know who's right, and they could all be wrong. Breaching this impasse has led to decades and even centuries of scholarly gridlock. But our friend, Professor Paul Bardunias, has a novel solution. He's an experimental biologist by trade, with a deep background in studying swarm behavior, both as it manifests in nature and how it can be put into practice with technology. Paul is also an active participant in Greek Reenactment, who has rubbed shoulders with not only the men in armor, but also the men with pens. This cross-disciplinary background allows for some unique insights. After all, while any study of hoplite warfare has to start with archaeology and the study of written or artistic sources, interpretations of such evidence must surely be grounded in practical realities. How can wearing and handling replica panoply and engaging in mass movement and mock combat inform our understanding? Can hoplite formations really retain their order whilst on the run? What actually happens when men clash with shields? And what happens when they break and run? In this series, we'll be putting ancient Greek warfare to the test with experimental research that seeks to falsify the claims of historians, and in doing so, help to solve the mystery of Greek warfare. I learned a ton while making this documentary. Now I'm sure this is going to be a topic that you're going to want to discuss. I'm looking forward to seeing your feedback in the comment section below, but our sponsor, YouGov, is actually looking to hear your thoughts on the matter as well, and will pay you for it. YouGov is an internet-based market research company, and they conduct polls on a variety of different topics ranging from politics to pop culture. Signing up is super easy, and once you're in, there's a gamified system where participation earns you points towards rewards such as gift cards to various stores. I find it's actually quite easy to rack up points and can knock out a couple polls for quick bucks between tasks throughout the day. For instance, while waiting for this very documentary to render, I actually took this 4-minute poll on my consumer habits to earn 1,000 points. This extra cash is a nice little booster that can help me buy games, meals, and home goods. YouGov is free to join, easy to use, and a convenient side hustle to start earning cash. So have your opinions heard by clicking my link in the description below to start your polls and start earning cash on YouGov.
When we ask ourselves, what is a hoplite? We really have to ask ourselves, when is a hoplite? Because a hoplite to a modern historian is a very different thing than a hoplite would be to an ancient Greek. Hoplite comes from the root hopla, which meant equipment or tool. For example, a ship could have hopla, which would include the cables and the rigging for the ship. So a hoplite is a man who is equipped with hopla, in this case for war. If a man were armed with a panoply, that would be pan, meaning all, oply, the tools, be all the tools a man needed for war. A hoplite then was a fully equipped warrior, a warrior usually with a big shield and a spear who could stand in a battle line and fight. Now the ancient Greeks would have used this for not only their own heavy infantry, but the heavy infantry of other cultures that could perform this function. So for instance, Egyptian warriors could be called hoplites. Many cultures around the Mediterranean adopted the panoply of the ancient Greeks. So cultures like the Etruscans, the Romans, Carthaginians, many of the southern Italians, Lucanians, people like this, Anatolians such as the Lycians and Carians, and other cultures colonized or influenced by the ancient Greeks borrowed elements from the ancient Greeks and actually contributed elements to the ancient Greeks. When we're asking when is a hoplite, it's important because hoplites can be divided into multiple periods. For our purposes, we're going to divide hoplites into an early Archaic period, which extends from the earliest appearance of what is generally agreed to be hoplites in the late 8th century BC to the mid 6th century BC. Then we're going to divide it further into a late Archaic from the mid 6th century to the early 5th century, And near the end of this period is when we see the interactions with the Persians and the Persian Wars. The last period we're going to discuss in our series of videos for hoplites is a classical period from roughly the end of the Persian Wars down to the rise of Macedon. If we look at the early period, the early Archaic period, late 8th century down to the mid 6th century, this is when hoplites were their heaviest. So hoplites in this period could be covered in bronze. Now these would be rich men to afford all of this, but a hoplite of this period could have a Corinthian helmet like this, which covered his whole face, leaving room just for the eyes and a breathing slit for the mouth. It had no openings for the ears, meaning that once your head was inside this, it was kind of like being in a bell. You could hear, but it was very difficult to localize sound around you. But it protected the whole head very well and the nape of the neck. One trick with helmets like this is that, much like the helmet of a medieval knight, they could be worn on the head, or like a medieval visor, it could be lifted and worn up higher on the head like this. You can actually run around a battlefield with it balanced like this with a well-fitted helmet. Another type of helmet from this period, which also offered a great deal of protection, was the Illyrian helmet. And the Illyrian helmet was one of the earliest of the hoplite helmets. It protected the face with these large cheek pieces. There was a cutout, a squared cutout for the face itself, but these cheek pieces came forward so much that actually a slash to the face would often be blocked by the edge of the cheek pieces. Both of these helmets, you'll notice on battlefield and in vases, were fitted with large crests. So you can see behind me, this Corinthian has a large crest coming off the top, a very high raised crest. And this would be of horsehair, although sometimes you'll see feathers attached as well. The purpose of this crest was to create a more intimidating overall appearance and to make the man look taller, and just to make the man look good, quite honestly. Also behind me, you can see what's called a bell cuirass, and this is a bronze armor that was worn in the Archaic period. Notice that it has a high collar that protects the throat, and it has a built-in sort of a skirt around the bottom, which gives it its name, the bell cuirass, and that was designed to protect against descending blows coming from above. But one thing that was very common for men who had to stand in the front line and fight in this period are pneumatides, or shin guards, or greaves, and these were designed to protect the lower legs. And the reason that the men needed these is, you can see the last piece of equipment, the aspice, or the shield behind me, and that's a real accurately sized aspice. And the aspice could protect the man very well, but it had a very interesting type of grip. And we're going to talk about this more in videos to come. But it had a grip that went over the forearm and a second grip that you held in your hand. And what this did is it rendered the shield very difficult to lower down low enough to protect your lower legs. So you needed some protection for those shins so that you didn't get hit with missiles and strikes. In terms of offensive weapons, the primary weapon of the hoplite was the dory, the spear. And this is an example of a fairly accurate spearhead from the period. You'll notice it's leaf-shaped. It's very, very sharp, often with a strong midrib. The spear itself could be anywhere from 7 feet to almost 9 feet. In this early period, they tended to carry 2 spears, one of which was intended to be thrown, and the other could be thrown or retained for later fighting. Most likely it was retained for later fighting. But both spears were usually capable of being thrown, and that meant that they often had large heads in the front and were balanced towards the middle of the spear, which allowed it to be thrown effectively. But these spears that were meant to be retained and fought with often had what are called soritors at the back, and these soritors acted as a counterweight for the head of the spear, helping with the balance of the spear. They also allowed the spear to be jammed into the ground so they could be held upright. If you're carrying a large aspice, you don't want to be bending down to pick up your spear often, so this was an easy way to keep your spear handy. Also, this could be used to dispatch fallen enemies. So if you're fighting with a group of other hoplites and some of them have fallen to the ground wounded, a wounded man on the ground can be very dangerous if he can strike at your legs with his sword as you advance. So this was a way of dispatching them. Speaking of the swords, there are really two major types of swords that we see in this period. One is the xiphos, which is a long, double-edged sword, usually with a pretty big cross guard, which allowed them to parry incoming blades and make their way through spears by parrying the spears. And also a kopis, which was a single-edged slashing blade, somewhat similar to a modern kukri knife in overall profile. If we move on to the late Archaic, from the 6th century to the 5th century, this is, again, the period in which the Achaemenid Persians arrive, we see a lightening of the equipment. So they still have the heavy bronze cuirasses, but now we're going to see a rise of organic corselets. So these are armors that are made of either many layers of linen or leather, and they are going to be in the form of a tube around the body and a yoke that comes over the shoulders. And they could be supplemented, the protection could be supplemented with scales, either bronze scales, and there's many different styles and patterns of scales, and often there's no consistency in where they are. Sometimes they're in the middle, sometimes they're on the side, sometimes they're on the yoke. The scales could also be made of iron or potentially even rawhide. We do see a changing in the helmets too. So the Chalcondychian helmet come into play, and that is going to be a much more open version of the Corinthian. Eventually, these cheek pieces are going to become hinged. So rather than having to wear the helmet up on your head, instead what you would do is just fold these cheek pieces up, and then you'd have an ability to breathe really well. Late in this period, we also see something, and that is we see ear holes coming into these Corinthians, and the Illyrians too, which makes us believe that maybe hearing orders or just more battlefield awareness was important. We also see, perhaps in response to the Persians and Persian archery, we see what are large aprons that attach to the front of the shields. And these would have extended down over the legs and been a supplemental protection for the legs. And we've tested them. They actually do work to stop arrows as long as you're pretty far away. The last thing we see at the end of this period and the beginning of the classical period is we see in the old style Corinthian helmet like this. Often they would wear a hat, a civilian hat, a felt hat called a pilos. Pilos refers to fur or hair. So the pilos hat would be worn up under the Corinthian to pad it and keep it stiff and stuck on your head. Well, what we see is this pilos rendered in bronze. And this helmet, as you can see compared to our Corinthian, is just the pilos helmet, or the pilos hat, now rendered in bronze. You can see it does not protect the face anywhere near as good as the Corinthian helmet, but it does allow you to breathe a lot easier. And it probably was very good protection from blows descending from above because of the cone-like shape. So you did give up protection from the face, but if you can see the aspice behind me, you'll notice that it has that robust offset rim. And if you can keep that rim up in front of your face, you can block the whole bottom of your face and keep yourself safe. We see other types of helmet coming into the classical period. We see helmets like the Attic helmet, Thracian helmet, Phrygian helmet, which has this sort of bulb on the top of the head. Other helmets like the Boeotian helmet, which was a helmet probably used primarily by cavalry, and that was a helmet, again, that was derived from a civilian hat. So it was just a metal version of a civilian hat. The other thing we see in the classical period is we see a change in the spears. Later in the classical period, we will see spears that can no longer be thrown. These spears, because they're not designed to be thrown any longer, they moved the balance point of the spear back towards the base of the spear. And what that did is it allowed you to have effectively a longer spear. If you have an 8-foot spear and you're holding in the middle, you have 4 foot of spear extending forward. But if you have an 8-foot spear and you're holding it much closer to the back, you might have 6 foot of spear extending from your hand. That's essentially the same thing as a 12-foot spear if you were stuck holding it in the middle. In order to do this, they came up with even larger and heavier soritors, and they actually sometimes would have lead balls on these soritors to move that balance point back. In summation, hoplites throughout their 500-year period were largely defined by their aspice. It didn't change much through the whole period. Their kit overall got lighter, and their spears perhaps became longer. I'll talk more about the role of the aspice in their warfare later. So we have to ask ourselves what implications this might have for their style of fighting. And the answer to this question has been the subject of academic debate for many, many years. Just as hoplites evolved over time, our thinking about how hoplites fought evolved over time. We can categorize the historiography of hoplites into 3 major periods. The first, in the 19th century, is perhaps the beginning of the systematic study of hoplites by a number of German scholars, who we can roughly categorize as the Prussian scholars. And their major view of hoplites was shaped by their view of contemporary warfare in the 1800s. The next phase of hoplite historiography, in the early 20th century, was categorized by men who were looking at hoplites as exceptionally ponderous warriors who, rather than being nimble and, really fighting it out on the battlefield, were essentially just smashing into each other and pushing each other. And this sort of pushing battle, which had a characteristic that was somewhat like a sport. And then finally, near the end of the 20th century, we have scholars who are challenging this earlier view and changing the view of hoplites into being something much more versatile and integrated with other types of troops. In this first group, these are what my friend Roel Kananendijk calls the Prussians. And they're not all from Prussia, but they're 19th century military men from Germany. Men like Hans Delbrück, who was a veteran of the Franco-Prussian War. He wrote a 3-volume history, and he was actually the tutor of one of the Prussian princes. Other men like Wilhelm Rustow, Hermann Kaufli, George Wyss, Johannes Krollmeyer. These were men who were writing history to instruct their contemporary military peers. So they were looking at the ancient Greek history in order to mine it for what they could use to apply to their own warfare. Now, this unfortunately went both ways. So a lot of what they thought they saw in the ancient Greeks was really clouded by what was happening in their military. So, for instance, the Prussian military was famous for its discipline. So you could literally describe their view of the ancient Greeks and their warfare as drill baby drill, because you had to be able to have highly trained men in order to move them on the battlefield. And this was really clouded by their own views at the time, not realizing that the Prussian levels of drill and discipline were as much about getting large conscript armies disciplined to move together as a unit as a general principle on how to get men to move together as a unit. They also viewed the phalanx of hoplites, the phalanx being the unit of hoplites, as a single mass. So a giant, mass of hoplites. There were no other troops involved. So light troops, missile troops were not in the phalanx with the hoplites. Cavalry, of course, were not there. They were forced out to the wings. And essentially, hoplite battles were just battles between these groups of hoplites. And whatever happened on the wings with the light troops and the cavalry were not that important to the outcome. Interestingly, they looking at the ancient battle descriptions, they also had this sort of view of a battle where both armies would clash, and often both armies would win on their right flank. And then the two victorious right flanks would then essentially fight a second battle and come together to decide. And this actually happened in some hoplite battles, but it's not something that you would say was a common or needed feature of hoplite battle. The next change, we jump over to England, and this takes us into the early 20th century. And a fellow named Grundy looked at these hoplites and their panoply, And what he saw were extremely heavy warriors, so ponderous that they essentially couldn't fight alone. They had to fight in a close formation. Essentially, they were handicapped to fight in a group because alone they were like turtles on their back. They couldn't really fight alone against other troop types. It also meant that they had to fight on flat plains because these ponderous, heavy warriors were not designed to fight, on hillsides. So in Grundy's view, this weight and this mass were the primary attribute of a hoplite, and that led to sort of somewhat obvious conclusion from his, worldview, and that is that hoplite warfare was kind of like the scrummage in a rugby game, which all of his peers would have been familiar with, and this sort of pushing match. So all of the men in the ranks of one group would push against all of the men in the ranks of another group, and there's some evidence for this in the way that the ancient histories were written, and the word that comes to us from the ancient Greeks is ophismos, and ophismos means essentially a state of pushing. It's a noun, a state of pushing. So these men focused their warfare on ophismos. Throughout that century, this became the dominant theory, and men like Victor Davis Hanson, he would later take the notion that hoplites were ponderous amateurs who won battles through mass pushing rather than weapon skill, and he'd construct a whole way of war that originated with farmers who showed up few flat battlefields, and they had this agonal struggle, it was almost sport-like, where they would fight out these battles, short, decisive battles. Men like Luganbill and Schwartz would defend the notion of this ophismos and pushing, while Ober would actually characterize these agonal rules of war that rendered war somewhat sport-like. By the late 20th century, this view had been cemented in what was called the Orthodox position. As well as a view of hoplite combat, the resulting model became linked inextricably to a Western way of war, a war that the Western people fought. And unfortunately, this also led to being linked to contemporary geopolitics. This link to contemporary geopolitics was every bit as harmful as the old Prussian link to contemporary warfare, and we see that it clouds the thinking into how these battles were fought. Actually, not long after the concept of this literal ophismos pushing appeared, it was challenged by a fellow named Fraser, but he was really unable to dissuade anybody from this pushing model. A more concerted effort to change this pushing paradigm of hoplite combat came from a group of scholars in the last decades of the 20th century. Their challenge to the orthodoxy was such that they were playfully labeled as the heretics by their peers. Peter Krenz would challenge the reading of this literal push in the primary sources. He would come up with different readings that would show that this was more of a figurative push than a literal push. He'd also challenged the assumption that hoplites were heavy and ponderous, reevaluating the weight of the panoply. He and a fellow named Hans van Wees, with authors such as Cockwell and Goldsworthy, would create an alternative model of combat, one based on more individual combatants and less on this homogeneous block of hoplites fighting. In their view, the battle was the sum of single combats happening along the front line, rather than just a tight mass that jammed itself into the enemy mass. Along with them in battle, along with the hoplites, there would be light troops, archers, and even cavalry can sometimes come together in this sort of swirling mass of what Van Wees called a motley crowd. And the combat would take place over an extended period of sort of hit and running, groups coming together, fighting and pulling apart, and intermingled with all kinds of other troops. All of these scholars had one thing in common. Military men or not, they had never been a hoplite, nor had they ever seen a hoplite. Because of this, they made a variety of pronouncements, often vehemently, for which they had no empirical evidence. What was needed was a context in which to understand the realities of the actual movement of hoplites and the actual styles of combat at hoplites. I'm an experimental biologist by trade. When I'm presented with a problem like this with no obvious answer, my instinct is to run experiments until I can provide data in which to build this context to understand systems. Coming up with experiments that would prove many of the things which we were assured cannot be done by hoplites or had to be done by hoplites was actually quite easy. The question, of course, is where do you find the hoplites to experiment on? In our following episodes, we'll turn our attention to a series of tests. These will be aimed at verifying and falsifying the claims of various academics on these topics. So, in summation, the reason that there's an impasse is because no one has actually seen a hoplite fight. So it's very difficult to understand the parameters of hoplite combat. Many arguments lack context and understanding the realities of what actually could occur or what really was impossible during combat. And the best way to respond to this or to resolve it is through experimental research. And we'll talk about that in our next episode.
A huge thanks to Paul Bardunias for working with us in this series. A big shout out to the artists and editors as well for putting this video together, and to the patrons for making these episodes possible. We couldn't have done it without this team and this community. If you like this sort of content, be sure to like and subscribe, and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.